Deep in the forests of Soviet Lithuania, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic secrecy and military checkpoints, stood one of the Cold War's most surreal manifestations of espionage tradecraft. It was a place that existed in a state of permanent contradiction, a location that was simultaneously nowhere and everywhere, a settlement that bore street signs in English, storefronts with American brand names, and residents who spoke with carefully cultivated Midwestern accents despite never having set foot on American soil. This was not a film set or an elaborate joke. This was a fully functional training ground where the Soviet Union prepared its most valuable intelligence assets for deployment into the heart of enemy territory. A place where future spies learned to become more American than many Americans themselves. The facility's existence embodied the fundamental paradox of Cold War espionage. To defeat your enemy, you first had to become them. The story of this extraordinary installation cannot be separated from the broader trajectory of Soviet intelligence operations during the 20th century. The roots of this American town on Soviet soil stretch back to the earliest days of the Bolshevik state, when Lenin himself recognized that revolutionary Russia would need eyes and ears beyond its borders. The Cheka, established in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, evolved through various incarnations into the NKVD and eventually the KGB in March 1954. Each transformation refined the Soviet approach to intelligence gathering, but it was during the height of the Cold War that Soviet espionage reached its most sophisticated and ambitious phase. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet leadership understood that the coming decades would be defined not by conventional military confrontation, but by a shadowy war fought in the corridors of power, research laboratories, and defense contractors across the Western world. The decision to construct an entire American town within Soviet territory emerged from hard lessons learned during the early Cold War period. Soviet intelligence had achieved remarkable successes in penetrating Western governments and institutions during the 1930s and 1940s. The Cambridge Five, atomic espionage rings, and numerous other operations had provided Moscow with invaluable intelligence. However, many of these successes relied on ideologically motivated volunteers, individuals who came to the Soviet cause through conviction rather than training. As the ideological fervor of the 1930s faded and Western counterintelligence capabilities improved dramatically in the 1950s, the KGB recognized a critical vulnerability in their operational methodology. Agents who had grown up in the Soviet Union, no matter how thoroughly briefed on American culture, consistently displayed subtle behavioral patterns that made them vulnerable to detection. They held their cigarettes differently. Their table manners diverged in small but noticeable ways. And their understanding of American popular culture remained theoretical rather than instinctive. The concept of creating an immersive training environment where operatives could live as Americans before ever reaching America was revolutionary in its scope and ambition. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations, began serious planning for such a facility in the late 1950s. The project received high-level approval from the Soviet leadership, who understood that the investment in creating this elaborate training ground would pay dividends for decades. The location selected for this extraordinary experiment was in Soviet Lithuania, specifically in an area near the town of Skrunda, though the exact coordinates remained classified even after the Soviet Union's collapse. Lithuania offered several strategic advantages for this purpose. The region was heavily forested, providing natural concealment from aerial observation. The local population could be easily controlled and kept at a distance through military security zones. Perhaps most importantly, the Baltic republics had only been incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, and their architectural styles bore closer resemblance to Central European and even American suburban aesthetics than the typical Soviet cityscape. Construction of the facility, which became known internally by various code names but was most commonly referred to simply as the American Town, or by its designation within KGB training infrastructure, began in earnest in the early 1960s. The level of detail invested in creating an authentic American environment was extraordinary by any standard. Soviet intelligence officers traveled to the United States on diplomatic missions with explicit instructions to document every aspect of American daily life. They photographed street signs, storefronts, gas stations, diners, and residential neighborhoods. They purchased American products, magazines, newspapers, and household items to be shipped back to the Soviet Union. They recorded American radio and television broadcasts. They documented the layout of American supermarkets, the organization of American drugstores, and the appearance of American post offices. Every detail mattered because every detail could potentially expose an operative in the field. The architecture of the American town reflected a careful study of typical American suburban and small-town development patterns from the 1950s and 1960s. Buildings were constructed with wooden frames and facades that mimicked American residential and commercial architecture. Streets were laid out in a grid pattern typical of American urban planning, complete with stop signs, traffic lights, and street names that could have been lifted from any Midwestern town. The facility included residential houses designed to replicate typical American middle-class homes, complete with front lawns, driveways, and garages. There were storefronts designed to look like American shops, a post office, a bank, a cinema, and even a diner, with a counter and swivel stools. The attention to detail extended to the smallest elements. Mailboxes were painted in American style. Fire hydrants followed American specifications, and even the trash cans were modeled on American designs. Populating this artificial America with authentic American products and materials presented enormous logistical challenges. The Soviet Union operated an extensive network of front companies and intermediaries in Western countries whose purpose was to acquire consumer goods and cultural materials for intelligence purposes. American magazines, newspapers, and books were regularly smuggled into the Soviet Union and delivered to the training facility. American food products, though often expired by the time they arrived, were used to familiarize trainees with American packaging and brands. American clothing, including undergarments with American labels, was procured through various channels. The KGB even obtained American automobiles, which were shipped to the facility so that trainees could learn to drive vehicles with left-hand drive and become familiar with American automotive controls and features. The human element of the American town was perhaps even more remarkable than its physical infrastructure. The facility required a permanent staff of instructors, role players, and support personnel who could create and maintain an authentic American atmosphere. Many of these individuals were Soviet citizens who had spent years in the United States, often under diplomatic cover, and had developed native-level fluency in American English, along with deep familiarity with American culture. Some were children of Soviet diplomats who had grown up in the United States and returned to the Soviet Union as young adults. Others were ethnic Russians who had been born in the United States and had emigrated or been recruited to the Soviet Union. There were even a small number of American defectors and ideological sympathizers who agreed to participate in training operations. These instructors did not simply teach classes about American culture. They lived in the American town and maintained their American personas continuously, creating an environment where trainees were surrounded by American speech patterns, behaviors, and cultural assumptions 24 hours a day. The training program for illegals, as Soviet deep-cover operatives were known in intelligence terminology, was extraordinarily rigorous and could last for years. Candidates selected for illegal operations were chosen with extreme care. The KGB looked for individuals with certain psychological profiles. They needed to be emotionally stable enough to live under false identities for years or decades, intelligent enough to master complex cover stories and operational techniques, ideologically reliable enough to resist the temptations of Western life, and adaptable enough to navigate unfamiliar cultural environments. Many candidates were recruited from families with strong records of loyalty to the Soviet state, often the children of Communist Party officials, military officers, or KGB personnel. Once selected, these individuals entered a training pipeline that would fundamentally transform their identities. The curriculum at the American town was comprehensive in its scope. Trainees studied American history, geography, politics, and culture with an intensity that would shame many American college students. They memorized the capitals of all 50 states, the names of senators and representatives, the locations of major cities and landmarks, and the details of American historical events. They studied American literature, film and music, learning to discuss popular culture with the casual familiarity of a native. They practiced American sports, learning the rules of baseball and football and the cultural significance of these games in American life. They studied American religion, attending mock church services and learning the behavioral patterns associated with different denominations. They learned to cook American food, to shop in American stores, and to navigate American bureaucracies. Language training went far beyond simple fluency. Trainees worked to eliminate any trace of foreign accent and to adopt specific regional American dialects appropriate to their cover identities. If an operative was to pose as someone from Chicago, they learned Chicago speech patterns and local references. If their legend placed them in Texas, they studied Texas idioms and pronunciation. Instructors corrected not just pronunciation but also intonation, rhythm, and the subtle musical qualities that distinguish native speakers from even highly fluent non-native speakers. Trainees watched American films and television programs repeatedly, mimicking the speech of actors until American English became their default mode of communication. Within the American town, speaking Russian was strictly forbidden, except during specific technical training sessions. Trainees who slipped into Russian, even in casual conversation, faced disciplinary consequences. Beyond language and cultural knowledge, the training program included extensive instruction in tradecraft. Trainees learned surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, dead-drop procedures, methods of covert communication, photography and document copying, lockpicking, and other technical skills essential to intelligence operations. They studied American law enforcement procedures and counterintelligence capabilities, learning to recognize surveillance and to avoid behaviors that might attract attention. They practiced maintaining their cover identities under pressure, undergoing intense interrogations designed to test whether they could sustain their false personas even under hostile questioning. They learned to manage the psychological stresses of living a double life, techniques for compartmentalizing their true identities and their cover identities, and methods for maintaining emotional stability during long-term, deep cover operations. The creation of a cover identity, or legend in intelligence terminology, was a painstaking process that could take months or even years. And that the KGB maintained extensive files on real American citizens whose identities could be borrowed or adapted for operational purposes. These often included Americans who had died young, whose deaths might not be well documented in official records, or Americans who had lived abroad and whose personal histories were difficult to verify. The KGB would construct elaborate false biographies for their operatives, complete with forged birth certificates, school records, employment histories, and other documentation. These legends were built with extraordinary attention to detail because they had to withstand scrutiny from American authorities and potential employers. An operative might be given a complete personal history stretching back to childhood, including the names of schools they supposedly attended, teachers they supposedly had, friends they supposedly knew, and experiences they supposedly lived through. Trainees had to memorize these false biographies so thoroughly that they became second nature, capable of recounting details of their fictional childhoods with the ease and emotional authenticity of genuine memory. The American town served as the final testing ground where trainees lived their cover identities in a controlled but realistic environment. They took jobs at the mock American businesses, opened accounts at the mock American bank, shopped at the mock American stores, and lived in the mock American houses. They interacted with instructors and other trainees entirely in character, maintaining their false identities even in casual social situations. This immersive approach allowed trainers to observe how operatives handled the mundane details of American life, identifying and correcting behaviors that might seem suspicious or foreign. The training included unexpected challenges and stress tests. Instructors might suddenly question aspects of a trainee's cover story, simulating the kind of casual inquiry that might come from a neighbor or coworker. They might create scenarios where trainees had to navigate unfamiliar social situations, testing their ability to improvise while remaining in character. The facility's existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Soviet intelligence. Even within the KGB, knowledge of the American town was restricted to those with direct involvement in illegal operations. The families of trainees were told that their relatives were engaged in classified government work, but were given no details about the nature or location of their activities. Trainees themselves were often brought to the facility through circuitous routes designed to prevent them from knowing exactly where they were. The surrounding area was designated a restricted military zone, and local residents were forbidden from approaching within several kilometers of the facility. Soviet military units provided perimeter security, and any unauthorized individuals who somehow penetrated the security cordon faced severe consequences. The products of this elaborate training program were deployed to the United States and other Western countries throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. These illegals represented the elite tier of Soviet intelligence operations, distinct from the legal residentura officers who operated under diplomatic cover from Soviet embassies and consulates. While legal officers enjoyed diplomatic immunity but faced constant surveillance from Western counterintelligence services, illegals had no such protection but also no obvious connection to the Soviet government. They entered their target countries on false passports, established themselves in ordinary communities, found employment in unremarkable jobs, and lived apparently normal lives while conducting intelligence operations. Some illegals operated independently, tasked with specific intelligence collection missions or serving as communications links for other operatives. Others worked to penetrate sensitive institutions, seeking employment at defense contractors, research laboratories, or government agencies where they could access classified information. The effectiveness of the American Town Training Program is evident in the operational successes achieved by Soviet illegals during the Cold War. While many operations remain classified even today, enough information has emerged through defections, declassified documents, and prosecutions to demonstrate the significant impact these operatives had on Soviet intelligence collection. Illegals trained at the facility successfully penetrated American communities, established credible cover identities, and operated undetected for years or even decades. They provided Moscow with intelligence on American military capabilities, technological developments, political intentions, and strategic planning. The information they collected helped Soviet leadership make informed decisions during critical moments of the Cold War, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to arms control negotiations to the final years of the Soviet Union. However, the illegal program also suffered significant setbacks that revealed the limitations of even the most sophisticated training. Western counterintelligence services, particularly the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting illegals. Defectors from Soviet intelligence provided Western services with information about illegal operations and training methods, allowing counterintelligence officers to identify potential indicators of illegal activity. Advances in document forensics made it more difficult to create forged identity documents that could withstand expert scrutiny. Most importantly, the human element remained the weakest link in illegal operations. Despite years of training, some operatives made small mistakes that attracted attention. Others struggled with the psychological burden of living double lives and eventually broke under the strain. A few were caught through bad luck or betrayal rather than operational errors. One of the most significant compromises of the illegal program came through the defection of KGB officer Vasily Mitrokhin, who exfiltrated extensive notes from KGB archives when he defected to the United Kingdom in 1992. The Mitrokhin Archive, as these documents became known, provided Western intelligence services with unprecedented insight into Soviet intelligence operations, including details about illegal operations and training methods. While Mitrokhin's notes did not include the precise location or layout of the American town, they confirmed its existence and provided information about the training program that allowed Western counterintelligence services to better understand how Soviet illegals were prepared for their missions. The end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 fundamentally altered the context for illegal operations. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, which inherited the KGB's foreign intelligence functions, continued to operate illegals programs, but with reduced resources and different priorities. The American Town facility in Lithuania became a casualty of the Soviet collapse. As Lithuania regained its independence in 1991, the Russian government lost access to the facility. Reports suggest that the site was hastily abandoned, with sensitive materials destroyed or evacuated before Russian forces withdrew from the newly independent Baltic states. The physical structures likely fell into disrepair or were demolished, and the exact location remains uncertain, though researchers and journalists have attempted to identify the site through examination of satellite imagery and interviews with local residents. Yet the concept of creating immersive training environments for intelligence operatives did not disappear with the Soviet Union. The Russian SVR continued to train illegals for deployment to Western countries, though the details of their training facilities and methods remain closely guarded secrets. The most dramatic evidence that these programs continued came in June 2010, when the FBI announced the arrest of 10 Russian illegals who had been operating in the United States. This spy ring, which became known as the Illegals Program, included operatives who had established deep cover identities and lived in American communities for years. The arrested individuals included Anna Chapman, who became a media sensation due to her glamorous appearance, but also less photogenic operatives who had more successfully blended into American suburban life. These illegals had been trained in methods remarkably similar to those developed during the Soviet era, suggesting that the lessons learned from the American town had been preserved and transmitted to the post-Soviet intelligence services. The case of the 2010 illegals revealed both the continuing ambition of Russian intelligence operations and the limitations of the illegal approach in the modern era. While these operatives had successfully established cover identities and avoided detection for years, their actual intelligence collection achievements appeared limited. The FBI's investigation suggested that the illegals had struggled to penetrate sensitive institutions or access valuable classified information. They had instead focused on cultivating relationships with individuals who might provide insights into American policy and decision-making, a less dramatic but still valuable form of intelligence collection. The illegals were ultimately detected through a combination of electronic surveillance, physical surveillance, and information from sources within Russian intelligence, demonstrating that modern counterintelligence capabilities had evolved to meet the illegal threat. The story of the Soviet-American town and the illegal program it supported offers profound insights into the nature of the Cold War and the intelligence contest that formed one of its central dimensions. The willingness of the Soviet leadership to invest enormous resources in creating an entire fake American settlement demonstrates the importance they placed on human intelligence operations and deep cover penetration of Western societies. The meticulous attention to detail in training operatives reflects a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in creating and maintaining false identities in a foreign cultural environment. The program's successes and failures reveal both the possibilities and limits of intelligence tradecraft, showing that even the most carefully prepared operatives remained vulnerable to detection through small mistakes, psychological pressures, or simply bad luck. The American town also represents something larger than a mere training facility. It stands as a monument to the surreal nature of the Cold War itself, a conflict in which the two superpowers never directly fought, but instead engaged in an elaborate shadow war of espionage, subversion, and ideological competition. The image of Soviet citizens living in a fake American town, learning to be American so they could spy on America, captures the Hall of Mirrors quality of Cold War confrontation. It reveals the extent to which the conflict was not just about military capabilities or economic systems, but about identity, culture, and the ability to understand and manipulate the enemy's society from within. In the decades since the Cold War's end, the story of the American town has taken on new resonance as the relationship between Russia and the West has deteriorated from the optimistic cooperation of the early 1990s to renewed confrontation in the 21st century. The arrest of Russian illegals in 2010, allegations of Russian interference in Western elections, and continuing espionage cases demonstrate that the intelligence contest between Russia and the West did not end with the Soviet Union's collapse. The methods may have evolved, with cyber operations supplementing traditional human intelligence, but the fundamental dynamic of states seeking to penetrate each other's societies and institutions continues. The lessons learned in the American town, the techniques developed for creating and maintaining deep cover identities, and the understanding of how to train operatives to function effectively in foreign cultural environments remain relevant to intelligence services on all sides. The American town in Soviet Lithuania existed as a place of transformation, where Soviet citizens were systematically stripped of their original identities and rebuilt as Americans. It was a place where reality was carefully constructed and controlled, where every detail served the purpose of preparing operatives for missions that might last decades. It represented both the sophistication of Soviet intelligence operations and the fundamental insecurity that drove the Soviet leadership to invest such resources in understanding and penetrating Western societies. The facility's existence reminds us that the Cold War was fought not just through nuclear standoffs and proxy conflicts, but through countless individual acts of deception, as men and women lived false lives in service to their states. The fake American town was real enough in its consequences, producing operatives who shaped the course of history in ways both large and small, visible and invisible. Its story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity of Cold War history, but as a window into the hidden dimensions of superpower conflict and the extraordinary lengths to which states will go in pursuit of intelligence and advantage over their adversaries